Good morning. Yeah, my name is Bill Pollack, and it's January 4th, 2011, and we're at the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles. And we want to talk with a good friend of mine, known him for about 50 years, Bruce Kessler, who's raced all over the world, and want to hear a little bit, some of the history of what it's all about. Good morning, Bruce.
Good morning, Bill. This is a very unusual interview for me. I've been away from racing for a long time, but my whole start in the best part of my life was when I met you when I was just a boy in high school and started competing in Southern California in the CSCC, California Sports Car Club events, and you were kind enough and to let me compete, and you were my mentor. You did such an outstanding job in the big machinery that you used to drive, and I was just a kid starting in a part of my life that I remember as being probably the best part of my life. When most kids went to college, I went racing, and the people that surrounded us, your friends and Bobby and you and Lance Raventlow, who was an important part of it, who was somebody I knew from school in Arizona, never realized that anybody would ever really care about these years.
So true.
I started in production cars, and
What kind of cars?
And I borrowed my mother's XK120 and told her.
Good move.
Yeah, it was a smart move, and then I found out that I couldn't compete at the drags because they wanted it to run as a roadster, and of course couldn't compete against a roadster, and I was going to Beverly High, and I'd drive by Pappy Pettigo's shop, a Texaco gas station on the corner of Santa Monica and Wilshire. It was on the southwest corner, and he had out that would be in the displayed in the outside an MGTC V860, and I thought, well, that was a really interesting car. So I started going in there, and I complained about this thing at the drags, and he said, well, you should be going to the road races. I said, well, that makes perfect sense. How do I do that? And he gave me an entry form. I think it was $25, I think.
Something like that,
something
yeah.
like that. And I put that together, and then you guys said, how old are you? And I said, I think I said I was 16, and they said, well, you got to get your mother to come sign. So I brought my mother down, and she met Bill, and she met another guy who was British, who had a coat, a jacket, a tie on. I think he did too. and she said, well, you know, what kind of a sport can't be that bad? I mean, there's nice people. So she signed for me, and that was how I got started. And from that, I can remember vividly. I guess I was still in high school. We went to build Willow Springs, and remember you got me out there, and we went out there, and we did all kinds of physical work. We drove tractors, we did things, and we built this, and we stayed in a motel, and you introduced me to the future Mrs. Briggs Cunningham. It was a big moment, and I won't go into any details. And then we went, and I can remember that race because when you look at the competition today and you think about what we had to race then, I think it was John Edgar owned a 4-1 Ferrari, and Jack McAfee drove it. And I drove my mother's Jag, and there were a whole bunch of people, but very few cars. You know, I mean, really no competition. And we ran that first race up there at Willow Springs, and which still pretty much looks like what it looks like last year.
Hasn't changed, yeah. Few new buildings, and that's about it.
Yeah, but from there I got a ride in an MGTC V860. It belonged to a college professor at UCLA named Maury Carton, a guy named Jack Otterburn, who was a technical writer, they had put this car together, and I think if I could pay the entry fee, I got to drive it. That was a real low budget operation. And from there, I got a ride in a Seattle Spider, owned by a man named Paul Stiles, who was head of Kaiser Permanente at the time, which I didn't know what any of that was, and probably was just starting at that time. And it was a. It had a E3 Jupiter, Jowett Jupiter engine.
Oh, my.
Whatever Jupiter was. But anyway, I went through, that was my start, and then somewhere in this period of time, I got a job after I got out of high school that was really key. Was I went to work for Warren Olson, and everything is timing and being in the right place at the right time, and I was a parts boy. Anyway, I under his guidance and under some of the people that were there, he had a mechanic that came to work for him named Cal Nide, who was an Indianapolis driver.
Yeah.
He had another driver.
One arm.
One leg. I'm not sure. I know he was injured. He had a handicap. There was another one-armed driver that came into my life, or one-handed driver later, but I'll get to. But this, then he had a guy named Al Sherman, who was a sprint car builder and driver, who later came to work. These guys worked as mechanics. Then another guy came to work there named Jack Russell, who we called Handlebars when you drove the Baldwin Special.
Right.
And Handlebars, at one point it said to me, "Do you know anybody in the movie business?" And I said, "No." He said, "I was a paratrooper, and between jumps, we used to sit around and write kind of caper stories. We'd all try and come up with an idea for a caper." And he said, "I've got this idea. I think it's really good. And I've written it, and I don't know who to give it to show anything to it." And he said, "But I'll let you read it." I said, "Okay, but I don't know anything about the movies or anybody." That little story was called Ocean's 11. And he was one of the mechanics on the Baldwin Special. And his name still appears on the screen no matter what Ocean's 11 that they do. So of the characters that were around, and then another character that came into the picture was a boy named Wally Green. We see his name all the time, Waylon Green. He's an Academy Award-winning writer, and he wrote The Wild Bunch, was his first movie. But Wally also came in and worked at the shop, and Wally had an owl, and it had a great big wingspan. I mean, it was one of these big desert owls. And you could put that owl up, and the Baldwin Special sat on a trailer in one side when we enlarged the shop. And it sat there, and this owl would sit up there, and people would come in and look at this owl, and they'd think the thing was stuffed, because it would never move. It would just sit there like this. And then we would, every now and then, when we wanted to get a rise out of somebody, we'd take a piece of raw meat and would throw it on the hood, and this thing would come down and had a tether on it. This thing would come down and would scare the crap out of everybody. So that whole group was around, and Bill was driving the Baldwin Special, and it was in there in there at that time. And I can't remember too much in the sequence of things, but they decided that I should drive a Formula 3 car, that was the best way to train me. They had high hopes to train me to be progressive. And I got some other rides. I can remember Bill driving the Aston Martin DB3 that they gave me to drive. Joe Lubin got it. It was the first one ever brought in the United States, and Lubin let me take the thing out. It was a race car, and I took it out, and I brought it over to your house, and you remember when we drove up, and you drove this Mulholland. I learned a lot in this period of time, but I can't remember too much. But the Formula 3 car, anyway, was very successful. It went on to win to win all the time. It was the best car and the best prepared car, and it brought people into the shop like Von Dutch, who painted it and striped it, and Lance started hanging around at that period of time, and he had a 300 SL when 300 SLs were brand new. We didn't see them on the street, all this stuff, and we used to drive it down the street in Beverly Hills, and would drive it with the doors open and Beverly Drive, and people would go, "God, what is it? That's amazing," and would say, "Oh, that's a Goldberg built in Israel," and they go, "No kidding." That's really good stuff. Anyway, we went through that stage. We all went through, and that car, anyway, from that car, and a short history of that car was it got dinged. I mean, dinged barely dented, and Lance looked at the car and said, shit, it's ruined, now we might as well race it. And I said, you know, you can't race this car, Lance, because it's not set up for it. It's got to have all this special equipment. So he went to Mercedes-Benz and he tried to order all the special equipment, and the guy that was selling the parts said, what are you going to do with all this stuff? The guy said, okay, here's what we want you to do. There's a guy named Charles Rosaghi. Remember Rosaghi? He was the Alfa Romeo dealer
Yes.
in San Francisco, and he has a warehouse up there that we have 20 cars in, 300 SLs, and this was when the Mercedes had their own showroom on Sunset and I don't know what it was, but Sunset and La Brea, or right down around that in that area. Anyway, we went up there, and we were told to look for a car with this serial number and take a magnet, and if the magnet didn't stick to the car, that was the right.
That was the aluminum one.
That was the correct car, and that was the cheater car. They had one on the East Coast, Paul O'Shea drove it, and this car was then assigned to Lance for me to drive. I think you drove it later somewhere, and I don't know if you ever drove this car.
I don't know.
Event or not. Anyway, this car, we brought this car back, and what we did was we duplicated his SL and this. We painted them the same. And in those days, things were so primitive going to the races that my little brother was in print shop at Beverly High. He could print the pit passes, and we got a sticker for the other car, you know, for going through inspection, and we'd put it on the car, and then we would make our own, and then we'd give away pit passes. And I mean, I can't even believe what it was like in those days. It was lots of fun. I kept thinking we're going to get caught, because Lance wanted to enter the car after every race in a Concours, and you know, when you take a car out on a racetrack, it gets dinged and it gets stuff on it, and we had these two cars that were matched, but the history of that 300 SL, that's how that car came into being, and it was later basically discarded, and then it was bought last 2 years ago or so for millions of dollars in Europe by a man in Seattle who asked me to come up and see the car and get photographed with it, and I keep thinking to myself, who would have ever thought? I mean, the car was absolutely, you know, just a car that we had no use for, and these cars are worth so much money now.
Oh,
you know. Anyway, from through that, and I went on to a 2-liter Ferrari and back east, and my career took off because of a race at Willow Springs, and then I went on to drive for Maserati right after that, because Ferrari didn't send me to an event, or Canetti, Ferrari US, and I switched back and forth, and I can't remember too much of it. I am reminded of some races by historians, but I don't really have a real memory of it. I do know that I was supposed to go to Le Mans to drive for Ferrari, and then about 3 or 4 weeks before the event, maybe 2 weeks, I hadn't heard anything, but I you know, and I got a call from Porsche, and John Fitch was going, and John Fitch, something happened and couldn't go, and John Fitch recommended that I replace him, and that was how I went over there. And then in that season, I had my first Formula One test, which was in a 250F Maserati, and you know, I'd been driving open wheel cars, and we didn't drive open wheel cars in the United States at that time, so it was uncommon we didn't have Formula Junior, and Formula 3 was a very small part of racing at that time. And anyway, I did fine with that, and I was going to drive for Centro Sud, and then I went to England, and I remember going to England to test for Giugiaro, but the most interesting thing about that was Reventlow wanted me to go to Lister with him, because he had the thought that Lister, who were very domineering in England, but not in the United States at that time, had not come in. They ran a 3.8 Jag engine, and they had a driver named Archie Scott Brown who had one hand, and he drove with a hook.
right.
Very effective driver, very good driver. And we went over there, and I'm not very technical. I am not a very mechanical person. I'm good at explaining what the car might do, but I'm not good at telling you what to do to fix it necessarily. But anyway, I go out to this shop with him, and in those days, John Cooper had a Quonset hut, and Lister had a Quonset hut, or Lister's place was a Quonset hut. And I can remember these two-tube chassis, but I mean, they didn't mean much to me. And I remember Lance and Lister talking, and they were talking about putting a Chevrolet in it, and that was what the discussion was. And when we walked out of there, Lance said to me, "Well, what do you think about that chassis?" And I said, "Well, I think it looks pretty good to me." He said, "Bruce, that's a piece of crap." He said, "We could build a much better chassis than that." And I said, "Oh, okay, sure." That was basically where the scare came from. We came home and with the idea, and he talked to Lance, and we spent a lot of time in Warren Olson, who he knows very well, Warren Olson's living room, sitting on the floor, talking about this car to be and how the car came to be, and that's how it started. And then we went through that season, but that season was 1958 when the car was first debuted, and I'd done some of the testing on it, and then in '58, a lot of things happened in '57, and in '58 a lot of things happened too. I remember in the beginning of the season, I was in Cuba. I went to Cuba to drive for Ferrari, and that was when Castro, when they kidnapped Fangio, which in itself you could write, it would be like that movie, it would be like the record that, I can't remember, the British entertainer made the record about the Grand Prix of Gibraltar. It would be the same type of comedy, Ustinov made that record, that very funny record about, called the Grand Prix of Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Well, Cuba was kind of the same way. They kidnapped the world's champion Fangio, and they get him back. And he gets in a room with us, and all the drivers, and he starts telling a story about what happened. And they had walked into he'd walked into a hotel surrounded by people that were asking for his autograph. And so a couple guys walked up to him in this crowd with a gun and said, "We're kidnapping you," and walked him out of this hotel, took him away. And we're all saying, yeah, what happened next? He said, "They took me to this beautiful mansion." He said, "Beautiful estate." He said, "Wonderful wine, beautiful women." He said, "But they said if I stayed any longer, it would look bad for their cause. So they had to return me." I mean, I'm listening to this conversation,
That's funny.
Race that went 5 laps that was supposed to go 100 laps. Anyway, I won't go into that. But all this stuff was going on. And at the same time, they were going to take the Scarabout for the first time. And Lance and I were the same age. He's a month older. He was born on January 24th. I was born on March 23rd, both of us in 1936. And the Sports Car Club of America, SCCA, who had usually had a problem with us because of our age or one thing or another, and we were now of legal age, had okayed his entry at Phoenix. So they took the car over there. Car had no paint on it. It was the first time the car was going to be seen. I flew back from Cuba, and they picked me up, and I came over there to see the car run with them. And for whatever reasons, I don't know, the SCCA decided they didn't want him to drive the car. He could not drive the car after they'd accepted his entry. So we're standing around there, and they said I could drive the car. And I said, "Well, I don't want to drive the car because it's Lance's car, and it's his first race, and he should drive the car." So we came to the conclusion that I'd go out and practice because everybody wanted to see this car run. And as I said, it had bare paint and very wide front end. Didn't look like it looked as we know the car today. So I went out, and the car was running out of fuel in one hard right-hand corner, but was very fast. And when I came up, it was the only time we'd ever had it on the track with another car. I came up against Arciero's short wheelbase 4.1 with Dan in it, and a very fast bend, a very fast, roundhouse corner of the top gear, big bend on this airport. And when I came up on him, the thing that was really noticeable was that Dan, I went around the outside of him, And I drove by him, and Dan was making all kinds of little corrections, to control the car. And I was driving this car like you'd drive your Lexus down the street. It was that much difference in the way the car's handled. And I think we had the first wide tires too. But that was the first time the car was seen out, and the car didn't race, and we put the car away. Then we went, and it was faster than everything. And then the car went into competition. Bill was there when it went. I went to Europe. I went back to Europe, and I can't remember. I get my dates and stuff confused. But I went to drive for Cooper. Oh, I went to Sebring. I won the GT class at Sebring and some stuff, and with Paul O'Shea in a very funny story about a Berlinetta, because what happened when you think about the time in racing, we didn't fly cars. Cars came on boats. I mean, it took a long time in those days to get a car to a race, and the races were a long time apart. Well, they had a shipping strike, and they had shipped this special Berlinetta that was going to run in the race by car, but they couldn't get the race cars done in time, so they put them in an airplane. It was one of the first times they'd ever done this, and it was a big deal. It turned out we had a shipping strike in New York, and they couldn't get this GT race car off the boat. So what they did was, George Ahrens, who was the money behind Canetti, he was American Machine and Foundry, and who was of a different persuasion, but a very nice guy, older gentleman. He had a 250 Berlinetta. It was a plain I think it had a radio in it. It was a two. So we had that car for the race. And the things that you remember about the race is they had a bunch of rules. And one you raced there, you had to have a light on before you came into the pits. And 6 o'clock you had to turn your lights on, or whatever the rules, whatever the rules were. So we're looking at all the switches, O'Shea and I said, why don't we just have them wire together a switch that says 6 p.m. and when we turn that on at 6 p.m. all the lights go on, whether it's daylight or not, because we couldn't figure out what it was. So we go out in this car, and I mean, it's a plain old street car, and we drive around with it, and we do okay. But Corvette, Dr. Dick Thompson.
Yeah.
Anyway, Bill Mitchell, who's the vice president, he shows up with a privately owned Corvette in these days. The factories did not compete. And he's got Troy Ruttman, he's got John Fitch, and he's got Dr. Dick Thompson, these guys with this car, that's just anything but a stock Corvette that's running against us. And there was no way we were going to outrun this car. But we looked at it as a 12-hour race and what have you, and we beat them. And the thing that I remember the most of, one of the things that happened to us with the light switch, during my time out at night in the car and driving around, the lights start to go out. Now, it was one of those crystal clear nights. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. So I go down the back straightaway, I turn the lights off, and I get to the end, I turn them on, and the lights get brighter. I go, oh, this is interesting. And I'm okay. I'm driving a production car, basically, but through attrition in this race, we're already up to third place in this. Everybody has fallen out. And the only thing that's bothering me is if one of the race cars, no matter whether it's ahead of us or behind us, comes up behind us with the headlights, anyway, they start reporting this mystery Ferrari. I turn the lights out, and I turn the lights on, and anyway, I get black flag, and I come in, and if you've ever seen an Italian pit stop, I mean, you could get more done at a gas station than you could when they're arguing with each other, and I'm trying to explain the lights are going out. Finally, they take me away. I'm getting very emotional about this. We're in the pits about 20 minutes, and they finally figure out what they're going to do. And Paul gets back in the car and goes out there, and we finish the race. We win the GT class, and we end up 5th overall. But the thing about it is, when they do at the end of this race, they roll you up on a platform. They have 3 winners: the index, the overall, and the GT. And they rolled this car up, and Paul was married to a woman named Robin. Robin had a drinking problem, and I mean, I can remember very well, they get us up there and they put us on top of the car, and we're taking our shoes off, and we're sitting on the top. And here comes Robin, and she's got high heels on.
No.
Goes off the hood of the car. I'm thinking to myself, oh, geez. Anyway, it was great. I mean, you know, those are the things that stick out in my mind. But General Motors asked me to come to Detroit immediately after the race. And I sat in a room that had no waiters in it. It had a Lazy Susan. I asked why, and they said because, and these were grown men that I was with. We had the guy who was the head designer at Chevrolet, the guy I can't remember his name, but the guy who was responsible for the quarter. All these guys were in this room.
Duntoff, was it?
Yeah. Well, in this room, and I said, "What's going on, guys?" And they said, "We wanted to find out what you thought, why you guys defeated us." And I thought to myself, I said, "What kind of a question is that?" I said, well, you were there, and I started pointing to the guys that were there, and I said, yeah, and I said, well, about 5 laps, 10 laps into the race, you stopped, didn't you, with a broken fan belt? Yeah. And then about 20 laps later, you stopped again with a broken this, and then you're in there another 30 or 40 minutes, and you fix that. Yeah. And I said, what am I doing here? I mean, we're all at the same place, you guys. We're out there going around, and you guys were in the pits all the time. And they went, yeah, I guess you're right. I thought, well, these guys, I was 22 years old or 21 years old. You know, I'm thinking, I'm looking at adults, and they have me in this room asking me these questions. It can't be. I went to England, and I went to drive for Cooper, McLaren and I on scholarship, and he had one car, and I went to drive for Rob Walker. And I think the biggest advantage that I had was for none of the reasons that anybody would ever assume. And that was, there were no names on the side of cars, remember in those days? But drivers had endorsements. And he had an endorsement for a guy named Harry Schell. He had
Harry Schell.
commitment for an American driver because he could get more starting money for an American driver. And Harry Schell had both a French
That's right.
passport and an American passport. He could, I don't know what but he was French American. And so I had, the minute he heard that I was there, he asked if I had any endorsements. And I said, no, I don't have any endorsements. And that was fine because Harry Schell had conflicting endorsements to who he had endorsements with and whatever it was with, even though they didn't have it was tires or whatever it was. So I immediately got swapped into that. I got lent and I went to drive there, and I drove. I remember the Daily Express Trophy Grand Prix, Aintree. Very, how should I say it? It was a real learning experience. I mean, when you think you're fast, and you go to some place like England and race with them in their own cars, you really get an education. I mean, you really find out how fast these guys really are on their own circuits. And when I went to Europe to drive, like in Formula One, I replaced Archie Scott Brown because the FIA wouldn't let him drive with his hook. So, there was an opening. An opening and stuff like that. The Nürburgring, which I don't get much, I get a lot of, there are a lot of collectors in Europe who are interested in the minutiae of racing, of things you would never think anybody would be interested in. But I don't get a lot of questions about the Nürburgring. The Nürburgring, at the last minute, I was told to go. I'd been doing a lot of testing with the GT Ferrari at Modena and sometimes at Monza. And they sent me to drive with the GT champion of Belgium, whoever that was, I don't remember. But he was going to be, it was a 1,000-kilometer race, and he would be the lead. He would start and finish the race. And I remember Von Trips and I, who were quite friendly at the time, he went to von Honstein and said, you ought to take Bruce to drive the 1,000-kilometer racing. And, Whiskey said, I'd take him, but I'm not going to take him to this track because I'm not taking any driver who's never been there before because it's too difficult to learn, which was true. It was too difficult to learn. And I went there a week early, and I had a rented, I think it was a Simca or a Peugeot or something, and I tried to learn the course. And after about 2 days or 3 days, I asked to be let go. I said, I can't learn the course. I just beyond my, I have no concept of where I'm going in 178 corners, 13, whatever it is, and miles, 13 or whatever it was around that place. And I was quite disturbed. I mean, quite depressed about the whole thing. The race car arrives, the Ferrari that is going to be in the race, and they tell me, calm down and go out there and start to practice. And I start practicing, and what I'm doing is I'm beginning to learn the circuit in gears. In other words, if I can be in fourth gear between point A and 3 miles down, I know, or 2 miles, and then this section, if I'm in this gear, I'm okay. If I'm in this gear, I'm okay. Now, this car, needless to say, was not a production Ferrari GT. It was a, highly probably modified, car that they had prepared for these type of events. And it turns out I come in and I'm finally beginning to feel more comfortable, but I'm not as comfortable as I'd like to be. And during this particular session, I did a spin. I spun 360 degrees, and it was a slow spin, not a high speed, and I came out facing the right direction, stuck at start, and, continued on. When I came in, there's a lot of commotion in the pits, and I didn't know what was going on. There are a lot of people down there and speaking to me in a lot of languages, and I was trying to answer, and what I got out of it was I'd broken Von Tripp's lap record in a GT Ferrari, and I started to tell them, but I said, oh, that's nothing. Let me back in the car. And I'm being dragged away, and there's Connors, my manager's got his hand over my mouth saying, don't say anything. And the next morning, I go to, the race is going to start, and there are a bunch of Americans, people that we know there, and so they invite me to breakfast. So I go up there, and I remember I went to the men's room. I can't remember their names, but they're people that you know. And one of them was a musician. And anyway, I go to the men's room, and a Ferrari mechanic comes in, and I get through the message. They've changed the starting order. I have to come back. I have to come back because I'm going to start and finish the race. I go, okay. I go back. Now, the thing that sticks the most in my mind about this whole event was you get down, and I was pretty athletic. I was 22 years old, and you used to run to your cars, in those days and jump in the car. And they're counting down in German, and they get down to what I figure is about 3, and I'm poised like this, and I hear this clap, 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 footsteps, just louder than hell, and then I hear this voice who I recognize immediately go, Hawthorne, you bastard! And I look up, and by that time, everybody's gone. I'm on the wrong side of the track. Everybody's running for the cars. So I get into the car. We didn't have belts. We didn't have harnesses. We didn't have anything. And I jump in the car, and it was very reminiscent of driving down Sunset Boulevard on when you leave Beverly Hills and you go towards the beach. That kind of winding road with traffic on a Saturday morning with everybody going to the beach. I mean, it was just like a traffic jam. You were just jammed in all these cars, driving, just trying to stay on the brakes to keep from driving into somebody because cars were backed up. And I start down this hill, and Joe Bonnier is in front of me with, I believe, a boardboard, but a racing boardboard, some prototype car. And I'm watching this wheel come off the back, and I'm thinking to myself, this is not going to be good. And so we're on a road, and we're going down and down this hill, and there's a very slow left-hand corner at the end of it where there's a bridge with concrete posts. Well, though I watch the wheel come off, he turns, I get around him. Maston Gregory goes by me so fast in this D-type Jaguar, and I know he hit something at the bottom, and I don't know what. What he did was he lost it at the bottom of the hill, and he took that car, and the car, it went from one corner to the front. It bisected at the stone point, and he was left. Went right by his shoulder. I think if he'd been in the other half of the car, there would have been nothing left of him. But anyway, this event is going on, and you don't get all the information. You think you get some of the information, but what they don't tell you is when that race starts at 10 o'clock in the morning, there are certain sections of the road, the trees hang over, and it's wet, so there's dew, and you're used to driving through there in the dry. And I see this Ferrari coupe in front of me, Berlinetta, go into this thing and lose it and flip. And I'm just, how you're just slowing down, trying to figure out, you don't know where anything is going to go. And then you feel it begin to get, I just didn't have that piece of information. It was fine. I did fine. And I kept, the way the pits are at the Nürburgring is you come by the front of them and you go make a U-turn and you come by the back of them. And when I'd come by the front of them, they would give you a signal, and when you go by the back of them, they'd step out there and go like this. I couldn't get it. I said, I don't understand, because I don't. Well, what was happening was that the Porsche team really thought they could win it because of the cars in the circuit, and that I was going too fast. I wasn't going fast. I mean, I was going what I thought I should be going. But the car itself was so highly modified, it was so much faster than they figured it should have been, whatever I was doing. My co-driver, the other thing that I remember from this event was I came up to the famous carousel. And as I was coming up, they jumped out with a blue flag, and a blue flag meant move over, you're being passed. And I figured, okay, I'm being passed. I mean, there's one of these modified cars coming up behind me. So I'm looking at the corner when the guy just runs out, and he's not standing out there, and he's running down and he's waving, and I'm figuring, well, shit, I'm right coming up, you can't quite see the corner, and whoever's behind me, I'll just get through the corner and get out of the guy's way, and whoever it is. So I dump the car in there really hard, and I start through it, and I see this Lotus. The back end is on one end, and the front end is here, and the driver is hanging out of the car. And I went, holy shit, I'm going to hit this guy. So I got off the throttle, and I turned hard right as far as I could, got on the throttle, car came out airborne. I literally, to get my heart started, again, I scared myself so bad. Anyway, I finished my first session, and the other guy went out, and he hit something, he crashed, and that was the end of the event. But I can remember, the other thing I can remember, the American servicemen being there. American servicemen were so happy to see an American, and I guess Phil and I were the only two Americans there at the time. Carol was probably there for Aston Martin, but there are very few Americans, and I can remember the support of Americans for Americans. There were just very,
right.
very, very few of us that were over there. The thing I can remember, the thing I would like to say the most, not get back into racing, is this was probably the most influential time in my life. When most kids go to college at that age, I had a different life. I was in a different type of circus or show business. I went and I learned a lot, and it was probably the best part of my life, as far as I remember. The people that I was around, the things I got to do. That season after I got hurt at Le Mans, I got sent back. I was driving with Dan. And I went into the first American professional races, which was USAC. And I drove it, the first two, which were Lime Rock and Bridgehampton. I drove some other races in here too, for Maserati and Ferrari, both jumping back and forth on the East Coast in '57. But when I came back, I'd been hurt. I got back in. I started driving for North American, which was Ferrari. Then I came out to drive against. I remember at Bridgehampton, they had Phil, myself, and Dan, and for North American, and Phil had that 4-1 Ferrari that he brought to Riverside, and that was the first time any of us had ever seen this car. It was built to beat the Scarab, and for whatever reasons, Phil did not finish that race. He withdrew at one point early in that first. That was the first U.S. Grand Prix when they started it, or that's what they were calling it, Formula Libre race. It ended up Joe Bonnier won it with the 250F Formula One Maserati. Dan was second and I was third. When we came to Riverside, that 4-1 Ferrari was going to meet the Scarabs for the first time. And we had 2 Scarabs that we had not run a race that long. They had not run a race that long. So they had to put more fuel. The race was, I think you were in that race with a Lister, I'm not sure. But anyway.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah, anyway, what they'd done was they had enlarged of the Scarabs, so and the third Scarab, which I was driving, had less fuel in it. It was a lighter car. It had whatever they had originally built it for. And our theory at that time, it was the first time we were going to run, and the last time, the only time 3 cars were going to run together. I mean, we didn't know that at that time, but the theory was that the lighter car could lead the race and could draw Phil out. And the weather was hotter than hell. Remember, it was just a scorching day. And I remember that the concept at the time was that Chuck would go the distance, Lance would go the distance, and I would stop and pit, but nobody would know that at the time. And then after that, whatever happened, just whatever happened, and I would try and lead the race. And I was on the outside of the front row, and Chuck was on the pole, and Phil was sitting in the center of this thing. But what happened the day before, Lance had a concept about there were so many left-hand corners and so many right-hand corners, and he set the car up to go right, I think. There were more right-hand corners, I think, than left-hand corners. So he basically wedged the car.
It would be clockwise, yeah.
Clockwise, and he set the car up to go that way, which meaning that he would have an advantage in the right-hand corners and a disadvantage in the left-hand corners. And he got into a left-hand corner down there, and he went off the road, not going very fast. I think it was turn 7. God, come back with your memory. And he got in a ditch, but it offset the chassis or something, so they had to take damage. They had to take the car back to the shop, put it on the table, and they couldn't straighten it. And Lance came to me and said, "Do you care if I split the ride with you?" I said, "No." And he said, "Do you care if I start and you finish?" And I said, "No," which I should have thought about. Because there are a couple things happening. One, to put Lance into that position in a car that he had not been driving, a lot of things happened, and he got run into in the very first turn. I think he got just slightly dinged. Von Neumann or somebody. Anyway, those things happen. When a race starts sometimes, and they pulled him into the pits. They black flagged him because they didn't know whether fuel was leaking, and they took the back of the car off, came off in one section. I was standing there dressed like this. We had orange coveralls in those days, but I mean, it was before all this stuff. I was standing there watching this thing like this, and the USAC inspector said, "Car's good to go." And Lance said, "Get in the car." And I went, "Huh?" I didn't even have my helmet. I ran around, got in the car. And we were the very first pit or last pit, the furthest from the first corner. The pits were on the opposite side. Anyway, I get in the car and I take off. And by the time you get to the first corner, you're going pretty fast. But I'm backing off, getting ready to come on, looking behind me. A guy jumps out and throws a red flag, which means stop where you are, which I stop where I get the car stopped, not having no idea of what's going on. And I'm looking back behind me, and I see people running, and among them Lance with an orange suit on, and worn. I don't know if the people, but I see the orange suit, and I said, I know it's Lance. And that was the incident where they crossed the track and where he hit, I guess it was Babe Stapp. They got in an argument. You were out there driving, but when they got in an argument about, which I didn't know what it was about at the time, about why I was red flagged. Well, the lack of communication in that time, they didn't know that I'd been okay. The car had been okay to go. So they had okayed the car to go, and of course, and then Lance took a swing at him, and that was the famous big Hazagasa at the start-finish line. But I didn't even know what was going on. Went to Nassau on a couple occasions. With that particular occasion, the next time I went, I drove the car that made Shelby so famous, the '88 Ferrari for John Edgar.
Oh, yeah.
And I drove that in the last race it ever really competed in before they retired it, and it won. And it was I didn't race against the Scarabs. The Scarabs, I did race against them, but they did not race in that race. And then the next in the next race, I mean, it's one of my favorite John Edgar stories, because there was a picture on the cover of Sports Car Graphic of me leaping out or leaping into that Ferrari during its pit stop, and it was a very dramatic photo. And the story behind the photo was that they had a mechanic named Joe Landacre, and Joe Landacre was the mechanic of the year. And I'm telling you, if you opened the hood, the car went 5 miles an hour slower. And if he touched anything, I mean, I should say that. But I mean, Joe. I mean, Landacre was quite an interesting guy, and he was giving me pit signals, and I couldn't tell whether I was in fourth or it was telling me to come in. But what I did notice was that right over the pits, they had built pits, and they had put a bar and boxes for the owners of cars up there. And John Edgar, who was very slender, was bent over. He looked like he was going to fall. He was alone up there, hanging over this ramp, and I thought, I've got to get in there. He's going to kill himself. And so I was leaping out of the car. I ran up there during this pit stop. I had to stop anyway. And I grabbed him and I said, John, get away from that rail. And I pulled him and I couldn't move him. And they had strapped him his belt to the rail. So I ran back down, and that's what the dramatic picture was about. Later in the car, the shift
I never heard that story.
I mean,
I love it.
John, there's so many great John Edgar stories.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
I've got an hour.
yeah, you could do an hour. You drove with him. I mean, for him. I mean, anyway. But that's how that dramatic picture came from. But anyway, I got hurt in the Examiner Grand Prix driving the Sadler Special, and that pretty much ended my career. I was unconscious for 4 days, and a lot of my memory was gone, and it still is. Certain things, I mean, I can be prompted and remember stuff, but I lost about 4 years of my high school life, which I rebuilt. But I was, when I came to in 4 days, I was conscious and talking, but when I came to, I didn't know where I was, and I wondered if I'd get back to the track and start the race. I didn't know that I had missed the race. That part of it had all gone by me. I do remember that we were having a lot of problems, and I remember Harold Day was talking a little bit about it, and Phil Remington were mechanics. What had happened when they had asked how I'd come to drive that car. We had seen that car at Nassau, and the car had been very fast, but it kept braking. It was one of those cars that you'd see it, you would go out there, it had a British driver in it, and it was owned by the NKG Spark Plugs, a guy, very nice, older guy who I referred to as being like my grandfather. He was on an airplane going behind us, and he kept kidding me, trying to get about driving the car and stuff. And anyway, when they had that Examiner Grand Prix, they were trying to get all of us in cars and drivers and stuff, and Ferrari didn't have a car, and Lance retired the Scarabs. And I made some statement like I'd drive, I said, no, I didn't want to drive because there's nothing to drive. And I said, well, I drive the Sadler or something like that. I made some statement, and sure as hell they sent the Sadler. They called him up, and he said, yeah, and they sent the car. The car had a lot of problems qualifying. It kept running out of fuel. I mean, just run out of fuel, go like hell, and then stop. And Bill Sadler was with the car, and he kept saying, "I know what's wrong with it. I know what's wrong with it." In the meantime, we didn't qualify, so they put us in this consolation race, and Aggie said, "Well, if you win this race, you get to go in the main event." Well, by this time, Harold and Phil and the guys had gotten around the car. It said, "Let us look at the car," and they had figured out what was wrong with it, and the car went out. And the thing I realized immediately was the minute that the race started, being that there wasn't much competition in it anyway because it was a consolation race, that I was so far in front of the first corner that all I had to do was just nurse this thing around. You know, if it got around, which is what I did. I nursed it around. I didn't even take the victory lap. I said, "I don't want to drive any further with this car. I'm getting out of this car." And that's it. And we didn't take a victory lap. We took it back, and then the next day, those guys were telling me, Phil and Harold were telling me that they had the car. The interesting question, you know, when the mechanics asked you if there's a rough spot on the track where you're braking or accelerating, and you go, "Yeah, you know, down here, turn one, you're braking, turn this, you're accelerating," so on and so forth. Could you take it easy? I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we had this car up on the rack last night, and we welded it in 8 places." And I went, "Oh."
Oh.
I went, "Oh." Well, it was very light, and it was very light, and it had a pre-selected gearbox. And it was anyway, that I remember that, and I since can remember up to the accident. I don't remember anything else except that the car it came from dead last. It was very fast, and in the race, the accident happened very early, and I was trying to get my pit signal from Lance, and I remember the pit signal, which was "Call your mother," whatever that was supposed to mean. He was having a wonderful time in the pits, and it was very early in the race, and I don't remember anything after that. I know I'd gotten Max's oil, and and so on and so forth. I drove a little bit after that. I came back, but I don't remember too much about that. I know I did. We ran a Riverside race with a Lotus Formula Junior car, and belonged to Ronnie Burns' San Ron team. And they wanted to run us at the back of the main event. And I didn't want to run. Again, it was one of those days where I just said, "I don't think it's a very good idea." You know, they came down, and I said, "I don't think this is a very good idea because there's so much traffic and stuff that you can't see a car coming. These little cars, they don't see you." And I had an accident with a little car. Ran out of road. A guy spun in front of me and down, we were so much. It was a small displacement car, sports car, but the juniors, even though it was a long track, were a lot faster than the small displacement. You know, their speed through the corners and stuff. And then I drove later the factory Brabham for a few races, and yet it was I was through. I just I wanted to be. I had to make a choice, kind of, in my life what I wanted to do, and I wanted to. I wanted to continue in the film business, which is what I did, and was already doing. I guess I had a lot of us had the timing in our lives is everything. Bill came too soon. I quit too soon. If you wanted to look at it that way. I should not have quit in '58. I mean, but I had a year off, and a year off I decided I wanted to do something else. It had nothing to do with fear or anything like that. It was a time of looking at, where racing was. We all came in different times, and racing was developing in different ways, and I look at that part of my life as being really the most wonderful part. The people that I grew up with, that were people like Bill and Warren, and that were the adults, young adults around me, and where I got to go and the things I got to see, were very, very important to me, and they probably formed me as a person. They probably had a lot to do with the responsibility of whatever I did in life, of the pressure put on you. When you go into a race car, when you go out, when you go racing, there's such, the pressure you put upon yourself, especially if you're driving for somebody else, and you have to perform, and you can't overperform, because if you go over the edge, they don't want you either. So you're kind of in a very fine little area that you have to operate in, and I think it was best said by Jean Barra. I read this statement when I was probably 20 years old. I read it in Sports Illustrated, and they were asking him about what it was like to be the champion of France and to be a Formula One driver and so on and so forth. And he said, and I can pretty much quote him directly, he said, "It's a very, very difficult place to be." He said, "because if you go too fast, you're dead. And if you don't go fast enough, you're already dead." And that pretty well described the little area that you put yourself into to perform, and how much pressure you put upon yourself. I never laughed. I always thought people would think I was screwing off if I thought I was having too good a time. The further up you got, the worse, the more pressure you put on, the more pressure you put upon yourself and I matured very fast. I had to. And you think about, all of us drivers think at a certain level, if you get through the first 5 years or whatever it is without killing yourself, if you're fast and if you get through, you're gonna be okay. You've learned enough that you probably can survive if bad luck, if luck doesn't, but you're always putting yourself in harm's way, because you never know what's going to happen out there, or what can happen. I'm just glad I got to be there. I'm glad that this guy said it was okay if my mother came down and signed me in, and was a good friend and a wonderful driver that I had to admire to watch drive, and to set an example for me. And I was lucky I was in the right place at the right time. The timing was such that I could have, as that term they always used when they were a meteoric career, it was just a great time in my life, and I'm glad I got to experience it. And I still have this, the people, fortunately some of them are still around. Bobby's not around, his wife. She was like, these people were very influential in my growing up, and where other kids had a more normal life, I was fortunate enough to get to do something that most people, didn't get to do. I was lucky enough, because of racing, put me into the motion picture business or into the film business as a director. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I started in that by accident. Bill's brother, who was a gifted entertainer, actor, unfortunately he's not with us either anymore, but I knew a lot of people on the surface and the periphery going in, but I never knew I would end up doing what I did. And none of this would have ever happened without motor racing. None of this would have ever happened. I made a very small contribution in The Sound of Speed, in my first little picture that I made that's still referred to and seen all the time. From a story I wrote in high school. But I really give motor racing the basis of where I went in the rest of my life. Without motor racing, none of this stuff would have happened. I would have never known any of these people. I would have never had any of these opportunities. And you know, as a director, when I grew up, every now and then I would say something. I'd be looking at a script and I would say, you know what might be interesting in this scene? Why don't we do this, and why don't we write this? And you know, it would be an interesting scene if somebody, and they'd say, where did you ever come up with an idea like that? I wouldn't want to tell them, but it was something I saw or a person I knew, you know, in motor racing. And I've been away from it for a long time, and in concluding this, I will tell the story about the first event I went back to. Brian Redmond had been after me in Florida to come to his Targa 66. He has a group that he puts together. It's a coat and tie thing where they talk as a guest speaker. And he asked me to come speak about the 50s, you know, what it was like to be in the 50s. And I said, okay, and I talked to him about the Scarab and stuff people were interested in, you know, in that era. And this woman at the end, I said, well, if anybody has any questions, she said, yes, I have a question. I said, sure, what is it? And she was the last question that I answered, and she said, what was the most interesting thing about motor racing when you drove? And I said, well, that's a really simple question. It was the people. The people were the most interesting thing about motor racing. I got to meet the most interesting people. I was around royalty, con men, all kinds of people. I was fortunate enough to meet the most interesting people of my time. And Brian Redmond got up and says, I sat down and said, that's the truth. That's the most interesting thing about motor racing, is the people that we got to meet. You know, not the cars we got to drive, but the people and the
Great
places
answer.
we got to go and the things we got to see. And that's kind of the way I feel about motor racing. So I'll answer any questions if Bill has any, or if anybody has any.
I think
how
we'll-
feel about it.
I wouldn't know where to begin. Or I think you pretty well covered it.
Yeah, I mean, that's my memories of motor racing. I mean, it was such a great time in my life. I can remember my mother and my father discussing with me when I said I'm not going to college, I'm going to go work for Warren Olson as a parts boy. My father said, that's okay, Bruce, because there's always an open door here. There's always food on the table. You know, you go out, the school of hard knocks, as he used to say, is not a bad school to go to, the school of reality. And my mother said, my father had gone to the 5th grade and had to go to work like a lot of people's parents in his, you know, that era had to do to support their family. My mother was a college graduate who was going to be a teacher or a professor. And she said, you know what I worry about is that you're going to miss a part of life, not about what you're going to learn, but that part of life that where you go to college and you mature and you adjust, and it's that I'm worried about. You're going to miss that part of life, that adjustment in your life. But I can remember very clearly walking up a road in Connecticut the night, I think it was before the first professional USAC race, thinking to myself about where was I in my life. I was going to drive for North American the next day for Ferrari in a car I didn't like. And how bad, where was my life at this point compared to the average kid I'd gone to school? And in no time, I had come to the conclusion that I had had by far the best life anybody could ever have, regardless if I didn't like the car I was going to drive tomorrow or anything else.
The one thing that sticks out in my head, motor racing was a lot of fun.
It was.
A lot of fun.
Yeah.
And driving at speed cannot be described. I mean, a lot of people have tried,
Yeah.
but
It's such a it takes so much concentration, so much focus to drive. I mean, I can imagine driving that Cat Allard, what it must have been like for you, because been in one, and I know you don't know where it's going sometimes. It has a tendency to pull up the front wheels and go where it wants to go.
I got out of a TC, it felt pretty good to me.
Yeah, boy, you're faster than anything. I mean, I can remember all those early experiences. I can remember my first event at Santa Barbara at the end of Saturday, quitting, saying I'm not going to drive anymore. And my friends, Wally Green and Chuck Rocher, saying, why not? And I said, because I don't know why I can't get through the corners with these guys. These guys, these old men, are so much faster than I am. I cannot figure it out. And they said, oh, come on. I said, nah, I'm not even going back. And they said, you got to go back. If they can do it, you can do it. And I said, well, they finally convinced me to go back. And I learned I had to slow down. I couldn't follow him through a corner, and I couldn't follow Phil Hill through a corner. If I slowed down, I could get through the corner. And from that point on, when I figured that out, that I started focusing on that, became a change in my life when I started to realize what you really had to do. But it took so much concentration, and it took to be able to be a little bit faster. I remember I won a hill climb. They had a hill climb at Pismo Beach, and it was dirt. And when I took my mother's XK120 up there, and I can remember looking back at it, how crude we were. We put weight in the back because our wheels were spinning on the dirt. And when I think where I went, what I learned about racing and about cars and about, and I can remember lots of great statements. I mean, lines that stick in my mind. I can remember Bill saying, we were talking about Tony Paravano, and Paravano had all these oddball one-off Ferrari Maserati things that he got, and I can remember somebody saying, I understand you're going to drive for him. And I can remember Bill saying, oh, I don't care. He said, I don't care about driving. He said, I just want the concession on the conveyor belts that brings these cars over. And I mean, there were so many weird cars that were in the, and I can, it was just a different time in racing. It was different. I owe everything I have in life really to these people, and to that part of my life is what guided me and took me to where I am today, because I certainly, I think those are the most formidable years in my life, and were probably the best decisions I ever made, or that my parents let me go ahead and gave me the support that I needed, that said, well, if you ever can't get a job, you've always got a bed here, and you always got a meal here, and then that.
That's surprising that they were.
Yeah, it is, because there's another story, and we'll get out of here. But my mother always used to tell about my father talking about the family. He said, he came to her one day and said, it's kind of hard to when people ask me about the kids. He said they always say, how's Ricky doing? Your second oldest. I said, we understand you got a scholarship to Wharton, and I go, yeah, Ricky's really doing well. And we understand the youngest boy, Stephen, got a scholarship to Bard. He's been writing since he's in high school, been published since he's in high school. And you go, yeah, Stephen's doing really well. And I go, how's the oldest boy, the crazy one, the one that drives the race cars? And my dad would say, he's doing very well. He's driving for Ferrari, and he won at Sebring, and he said, but I feel very awkward. And my mother looked at him and say, Jack, it could be a lot worse. They could be saying, how's your son, the ballet dancer? That's kind of I don't think I have much more to say. But, when you look at, these were the most formidable years in my life, and it was because of these people that made my life what it is today, which I'm happy to say I'm retired. I'm in one. I never thought about getting hurt. I will say one thing, that when I look at, and I understand very well the change in the times and what's what's going on in driving, and there was an American driver that was a Formula One driver that was killed in England, and his name was Peter Revson. At one time, they wanted to get Peter and I together. They saw some similarity, even though I was retired and I was a director, but they put an interview together. And we talked, and Revson, and after the interview was over, we're going to lunch, and I said something to, I don't know what prompted it, but I said something to Peter about, you know, Pete, he was complaining about something. He's going to India. It wasn't long after this that he got killed. And he said about the car he was driving, and I said, you know, when are you going to hang it up? And he also had a Ford agency. It wasn't under his name or anything. And he looked at me and he said, how can you even ask that, Bruce? He said, you know how long it took to get here? You know how much work it took to get to where I am now? And I said, yeah, I do know. I know exactly what you're saying. You put a lot into your life to get to where you get an opportunity to perform. You know, timing is everything, and unfortunately it wasn't long after I was killed at the British Grand Prix, but there was a lot of similarity between us. I don't know what I would have ever done in racing. I had matured a lot. I really had matured. When I say I had matured, Bill understands what I mean as a driver. I mean, I knew that you couldn't win every race. I knew that you had to make decisions out there that at times that you may not have made at a younger age. You may have done something, made another decision. But I'd matured very, very quickly in the cockpit of a race car, of what my limitations were, what I could do and what I could not do on that given day. You know, there were some days when were better days for you, and when everything worked better for you, and everything. Again, a lot of that is, I get a lot of questions about Monte Carlo, and that they tried 3 drivers in the car, and I was the fastest driver. And but the thing that they don't know, and I can't think of the driver's name. Moss kept saying to me, that car can't qualify, and you're going to replace, and Rob Walker had brought a Formula 2 Cooper and had stuck a bigger displacement climax. This is in the very beginning of this stuff, and brought it over, and they were putting the French driver in who, he was an older driver. I mean, he was probably in his 40s. They considered him an old, an old driver that was finished. You know, he shouldn't even be doing this kind of stuff in the car. And they said, you know, he's not going to be fast enough, and they're going to put you in that car. Rob has a lot of confidence in you now after the last race, put you back in the car, and you'll get in the race. Well, this guy qualified that car in the middle of the field and won the race. It was probably the last race he ever drove. And you keep thinking about your life. What if this had happened? What if that had happened? What if I have no qualms about my life. I'm just glad I had that section of my life to look back at, the fun we had, the infamous Formula 3 race at Seattle for the national championship when I must have been 19 years old, 20 years old. There were 2 John Foxes, one from Sacramento and one from Seattle. The John Fox from Seattle was a motorcycle champion. He was probably 22 years old. They put him in a Formula 3 car, and he was dominating it. And everybody said it was going to be the end of my winning streak when I arrived up there. Harry Morrow calls us up and says, you guys have any interest in, I'm going up to Seattle. I know you are too, but I've got a double-decker trailer and I got a new Studebaker pit station wagon. Do you mind if you guys want to ride up? I'll drive the car up and bring it back for you. We said, oh yeah, sure, no problem. We get up there, and the first day of practice, we got 2 or 3 days of practice. First day of practice, no car comes. We're getting real nervous. There's no such thing as a cell phone. We can't figure out where the car is gone, where Harry is, or where anything. Second day, a truck drives in full of chickens towing the 2 race cars. Now we get the car off, and this is the big race. This is going to be the race that means everything. They get the car off, car goes out, and tachometer breaks. And these engines, these Norton engines over rev, they bend a valve, and they go pop, pop, pop. They all sound the same, so I don't want to practice. I have a limited time, so they get a motorcycle, they go to a motorcycle shop, they get a cable, they fix the tachometer. I go out the next day and I start to practice the whole, and the car quits. I mean, it quits just like that. It doesn't die, it just stops. And I coast it in, I kick it in gear, and it starts, and I go back in, I get it. They find a little tiny piece of something that's floating in the magneto. The night before the race, I'm an asthmatic, and I go to sleep and I have my little spray on, and all the juice runs out of it. I wake up wheezing and I can't find a place to go. I go to the hospital, they give me a shot of adrenaline, I'm sitting there trembling. I go to the track and Warren looks at me, and he knows Warren very well. And Warren is a very quiet, modest kind of person who would never make any kind of a statement of any. And I'm sitting in a camp chair and he goes, "Are you going to be okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I'm going to be okay." And this other camp is right next to us. They've got all the formula cars, and these guys come over and they say to Warren, I'm sitting there, "Well, what's your strategy today?" And I'm looking, I'm wondering what Warren's going to say. He's going to probably say, "Well, if our car stays together, we think we have a very good chance." You know, the normal. Warren turns and looks at them and says, "We're going to use the same strategy we always use. And we've been using all season." And they went, "Oh yeah, and what's that?" We said, "We're going to get out in front and increase our lead." And I went, "Oh boy, God, please, just don't say something like that." Well, they start these cars on a rolling start, and we go to the back, and they've got, and you're always the fastest cars are at the back till they stop doing that because it was
It's stupid.
yeah, it was too dangerous, but we're at the back. And we're rolling, and we do the same thing. We jump, both of us jump the start, Fox and I, and we go through the pack, and we get down to the first corners, we're approaching it. I'm noticing something's wrong. I can't see. I'm thinking about this, and I realize my goggles, Fox is right alongside of me. My goggles are up on top of my helmet. And I go, you know, you're laying down in this car. I just pulled my goggles down and smiled at him. I never saw him again. Well, that circuit is tree lined. You can't see around it. So I drive around, race ends. I go in, I go to the winner's circle, I get the flag, I go around, I come back in again, and I pull in to give him back the flag, and I see Fox is over here, and there, I can tell by the body language there's an argument going on with the officials. And I said to Warren, "What's happening?" He says, "Oh, he thinks he won the race." I said, "How can he think that?" And he said, "Well, he didn't think anybody could drive any faster than he did and keep their machine together." I said, "You got to be kidding." He said, "That's not the best part." I said, "What's the best part?" He said, "He wasn't even second, he was third." I remember these moments in my, you know, in your life as a. Anyway, like I said, I owe it all to these people who gave me that part of my life. So I quit. That's it.
Hey, thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bill.